We acknowledge that this event is taking place upon the traditional territories, the territories of the Haudenosaunee of the Six Nations Confederacy, the Anishinaabe peoples of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nations, and before them the Chinantan Nation, called the Neutral by the French and the Attawandaron by the surrounding nations. These people are the original caretakers, the peoples that lived on and intimately worked with these lands. We acknowledge that we have a responsibility to know and understand their heritage. The treaty that was signed for this territory is the Between the Lakes Treaty, No. 3 of 1792, and further the deed referred to as the Haldimand Proclamation of 1784, which applies to the land 6 miles on either side of the Grand River, from the mouth to its source. We need to be aware of our role in these documents. We also recognize the enduring presence of Indigenous peoples upon this land. We acknowledge that we have an obligation to learn to live wisely together on this land.
Hello, thank you for tuning in to another speaker series event with the Brant Historical Society. My name is Esther Brouwer. I'm the education officer here at Myrtleville House Museum, and today we're going to be talking about Canadian fashion history from around the 1700s up until the early 1800s. Introduction. Although Europeans had first visited Canadian shores around the year 1000 AD in the form of Norse explorers from Greenland, and Samuel de Champlain created the first permanent settlements in Nova Scotia and then Quebec in 1604 and 1608. It was likely difficult for these early settlers to get access to or even care about fashion trends back in Europe. The first homesteaders were working men, sent to begin a trade route with the local Indigenous groups and find a way across the continent. They dressed with a mix between European clothing, adapted for the different climate, and adopting the dress of the local people, who were obviously used to living off the land after about 12,000 years. There was a large imbalance at this time between the male and female population with these French colonies, since women had to pay for their passage, and most did not want to leave their established homes for the unknown of the New World. But by the 1660s, France was becoming concerned with the growth of the English colonies to the south and decided to send a large group of young single women who volunteered to go. The king sponsored their passage and dowry once they arrived, and so they were called the filles du roi, or king's daughters. Over 10 years, about 800 of women between 12 and 30 were sent to New France, which doubled its population. It may be safe to say that the fashion and style expanded during this time with the help of these middle and lower class women from the cities of Paris and Normandy. At the turn of the 18th century, clothing was made by hand, most likely by the people that wore them. Both men and women could sew, mend, and darn. The occupation of milliner, sort of like a modern tailor or dressmaker today, would be rare in all except the most populated settlements, and fabric options would be the basics. It's likely that men would have worn clothing made from leather more often than linen, cotton, and wool. Weaving was not a widespread option until the early mid-18th century, but there was local makers of shoes and hats by the late 17th century. Now, places like Quebec and Montreal were not desolate, frozen wildernesses, and the colonists imposed a class system on themselves, similar to what they had in France. At the top were the appointed officials, wealthy landowners, upper clergy, and high-ranking military officials. The middle class was made up of merchants, traders, shopkeepers, and tradespeople. The habitants made up the lower class, which consisted of farmers, fishermen, and the like. Below these classes were indentured servants and slaves. In general, the upper and middle classes wore the same types of clothes, separated by the material used and the cut of the fabrics. Upper-class men wore lavish outfits made from silk and lace, with highly decorated embroidery work. Both men and women decorated their outfits with expensive handmade lace, gold or silver thread in embroidery, and silk stockings and shoes. Women of the higher classes had dresses with long trains over multiple layers of petticoats, and a train on the dress back in France denoted one's level of nobility. Gloves, parasols, and silk ribbons were a must for these women, and the latter of these were also used by men when holding up their silk stockings. Middle classes in New France still had access to silk and other fine fabrics. Men wore smaller wigs and felted fur hats. Their waistcoats were less decorated, but probably had cloth-covered or metal buttons. Their stocks, or cravats, would be made of muslin or silk in rare cases. Women still had decorative clothing and smaller lace collars and aprons. Dresses were well fitted and fine caps were worn over their hair. These middle-class women would have carried around a fan or a parasol. The clothes of the lower classes were made up of fabrics made by locals or handmade from what the fabrics they could afford from the local milliner. These clothes were meant for durability more than comfort or style. So linen, coarse wool, and leather were the staple materials. Men's fashion showed the influence of indigenous peoples much more than women, who would only adopt moccasins and shawls made or inspired by the local women. Men had taken the moccasins, leggings, and during hot summer days, the breech clout. Men would also wear wide-brimmed hats to keep the sun off their necks, and in the winter a double-knitted toque or voyageur cap to keep the chill out. Shoes other than moccasins were made from stiff leather and had a buckle for closure, or a pair of wooden clogs could be worn. Layers of clothing. How early homesteaders in Canada got dressed each morning differs greatly for how we do it today. Both men and women had a main undergarment that also acted as a nightgown. This was known as a chemise, shift, sarc, or simply undershirt. Most were made from linen, men's went down to just above the knee and women's to knees or mid-calf. The next layer put on for both men and women would be the stockings, made of wool or silk and held up with garters above or below the knee. Shoes were usually put on next before the stays because it was difficult to buckle the shoes on with the stiff bodice pieces. Sometimes lower classes or working women would go barefoot in the summertime. The next layer for women consisted of stays, petticoats, and bustle pads for higher classes. Stays, not corsets, replaced bodies, which were the outermost layer for women in the previous century. Stays were lined with whalebone, or baleen, for the high classes, cowbone for the middle classes, or simply wood for the lower classes. There is also plenty of evidence of stays being made from thick leather instead of boned fabric. Baleen had the most spring and bend to it, so it was the most desirable material. Stays could be front closing or back closing, depending. Another form of the bodice during the century were the quilted jumps. These were not boned, but made of layers of quilted cotton. Jumps were used more as a loungewear around the house, a sort of sports bra of the age. Pockets were like small side pouches tied around the waist rather than sewn to the petticoats. This would be tied under the top layer of petticoat, which had slits at each side to reach the pocket. Petticoat lengths depended on your social class. The longer, the higher class you were. Linen, cotton, and wool were the materials used, again, depending on the season. Over all this, a jacket or full gown would cover the underlayers. Around the shoulders, a triangular neckerchief, or fichu, helped keep the sun off the shoulders, neck, and chest. Men's layers over the shirt consisted of a waistcoat made of wool, sometimes leather and silk for the upper classes, backed with cotton. Most waistcoats were adjustable to grow with the man, or to be given to any sons as hand-me-downs. Buttons were made from wood, bone, metal, or cloth covered to match the fabric. Over the waistcoat would go the frock coat, usually made to match the waistcoat for the upper classes, or made from similar materials for middle and lower classes. Overcoats for men changed throughout the century from wool coats made from blankets to large floor-length redingotes in the 1800s. Trousers and breeches were worn by all classes throughout the period. Breeches fell to just over the knee and began the period by having a fall front waistline. By the end of the 1820s, full-length trousers with a more modern button fly was the preferred choice. Since Canada's English-speaking population had a large number of Scots, the kilt could also have been worn by military personnel. Tartan had been banned after the Jacobite Rebellion of 1746, but only in Scotland. Scottish settlers most likely adapted their tartans to fit the colder winters with indigenous clothing, or turning the kilt into trews, or trousers. Silhouettes. Now we're going to go through the changing silhouette of women's fashion from around 1720 to 1830. First up, we have the classic sack-back gown, which has a pleated back that separates from the waistline and falls away similar to a cape. You can see the shape better in this jacket coming off the square neckline that continued through the century. During the 1740s and 50s, the Rococo style of giant hips swept through the French court. Legends of the beginning of this trend was that wealthy women riding in their carriages through the countryside would see women working in the fields with their petticoats hiked up and tucked into their apron bands at the sides, giving them a wonderful shape and the illusion of large childbearing hips. Paniers, or hip pads, were the wealthy woman's solution for these false hips. At the court of the French king, these paniers could be so wide women would have to walk sideways through door frames. In Canada, they probably would have been much smaller and much more practical. The 1760s became a more rounded shape in the skirt and more decoration added to the front of the bodice and skirt. The 1770s and 80s reduced the size of the skirt once more, but still added decor to the hemlines. This was also a time when the chintz patterns became popular, having been traded by the Dutch East India Trading Company from hand-printed cotton in India. In 1790, the silhouettes began the change towards the classic Regency shape that we associate with the Jane Austen novels. The petticoat and gowns still had a fullness to them, but the waistlines began to rise from the natural waist to just under the bust. There was also a change in how the clothing was put on, and more importance on loose fitting and ease of wear. The next decade still had some fullness to the gowns, now usually made of one piece rather than separate petticoats and jackets, or open gowns. Full-length sleeves were also now the norm for day dresses rather than three-quarter lengths. The 1810s were the peak of the Regency style. The Greek revival occurred during the Regency, and women's dress began to look more and more like a Greek column. Men's silhouettes became all about showing off a masculine, powerful figure, and women's were all about rounding out the shape and looking soft. The waistcoats and coats of men were cut to the waist to show off the barrel-shaped chest and revealing the athletic calves and thighs. Some men even stuffed their stockings to make their calves look bigger. Following the last decade, the 1820s began a return to the wider gowns. Carried over to this period was fabric manipulation, wider necklines, and rounder sleeves. Finally, the 1830s saw a drastic change in shape, especially in the sleeves. What became known as the mutton chop sleeve was created in the late 1820s and became the norm until an economic depression later in the 30s. After that, women's clothing became much more subdued, and men's outer clothing became almost exclusively all black, a trend that continued through the rest of the next century. Another fashion trend that lasted through the centuries that began in the late 1600s was the riding habit. This was an outfit for women that was patterned off the military costumes of the day. Originally for wear during hunting or riding trips, it became a sort of day wear for everyday outdoor use. Okay, so like we talked about, this is our first item that both men and women would have worn. This is a woman's shift, chemise in French, also called a sarc in some places, but basically it was the undershirt. So you can tell it's basically made out of rectangles and squares and triangles, trying to make the fabric as useful as possible. So the main body here is just one long rectangle, and then they would have added the extra fabric in triangles along the side. Sleeves are long rectangles with squares as the gussets underneath, and that's just to give you kind of extra arm movement. It was this that was used as like a nightgown, and then worn under all their other clothing as well. Before anything else went on, then both men and women would have put stockings on. So I've got a few examples of stockings over here. So of course, Canadian winters, we want kind of knitted woolen stockings. So these would have gone on legs, gone up to over the knee. Women usually tied it with a garter above the knee, and then men had garters kind of below the knee. We've also got kind of patterned ones, and then we've got silk stockings for kind of the upper classes that we would have. Men and women pretty much had the same kind of stockings. And then shoes would have gone on. Now, for women especially, shoes and stockings would have gone on first, because once you put the stays on, it would have been very difficult for the kind of bending over to tie the shoes and everything like that. So next we have the stays. In focus?
Yep.
Okay. Okay, so now we have the stays on. So we talked about stays, corsets, bodices. They're all kind of different in history. This is one specifically stays based around the 1800s, 1700s, 1800s. Most would have either shoulder straps, some don't have shoulder straps, come in all different shapes. This one you can see is laced up one way, so rather than kind of lacing it like our shoes with two strings, we have one string at the top that goes all the way to the bottom, and then the other one goes across like that, and then they tie at the bottom. You can see on the back, we don't have a lace up, so it's basically depending on personal preference or kind of status, if you would have it lace up at the back or the front. Most of the time it could be the back. If you had like a servant to help tie it up for you, then you could do the back. Otherwise the front was an easy way to do it yourself. Once we had the stays on, it wasn't to suck you in or anything like that. It wasn't to make you skinny. It was just a piece to help support. So that's all it was, and to give you a nice like conical shape. That's kind of the shape that they were after for their torsos, and then the bottom half was given for the kind of larger stuff. So next we have our bum roll. So we have a nice little roll here, little sausage stuffed. So this is kind of the smaller one that I have, and then we also have a larger one. We're going to start with kind of the lower classes with a smaller one, and this would have been tied around the back of the waist here, tied up the front. And that was just to kind of help the petticoats come out from the legs and to give you an extra little kind of bump at the back. All right, now we'll move on to the petticoats. Okay, so now we've got our first petticoat to go on. Now, the one thing I like about 18th century petticoats is they're kind of almost one size fits all. They were made to move with your body, they were made to grow with you or shrink with you, so they're kind of tied a little bit different. You can see I've tied one side, the back first, to the front here, and then we take the front piece, do the same thing, match it up with the center line, and tie it in the back. Now this petticoat's made out of linen. Most of them would have been made out of linen, cotton, wool in the wintertime, or you could also have a quilted petticoat, which we can show later. So there's our first petticoat. 2 probably would have been the requirement for petticoats, 2 or 3, depending again on your rank in society. So there's our first petticoat here. We're going to put a cotton one on next. And then to basically find the front and the back, you can see the pleating is pretty much the same on both sides, but on the back we have kind of a inside box pleat, and on the front we have a flat box pleat. Now again, length would have been kind of showing off your status as well. The shorter the skirt was, the lower in class you were. Train in the skirt was kind of status symbol, so like the highest ranking members of society would have a train in the dress, but for the most part everyone would have kind of a flat hemline, depending somewhere between the knees and the ankles. Alright, so our next piece is called the fichu. So this was kind of like a neckerchief or a handkerchief that would go around the neck to protect the back of the neck and to protect kind of the shoulders and chest area. Normally this would be pinned to the bodice or the stays, just to kind of keep it in place, like so. And that way that does kind of also covers up the shift underneath and protects the back of the neck here. All right, and over top of this we're going to put our jacket. All right, so we got our jacket on. So now we've got, you can see this is called a caraco jacket, and based on the swallowtail design. So you can tell it's called a swallowtail because the back of the dress looks a bit like a bird's tail. And yeah, again, this is kind of a basic outfit for kind of the lower middle classes. Got the fichu covering up, we've got the jacket kind of accentuating the cone shape of the stays, and then we've got the petticoats underneath. Another thing to top this all off would be any kind of lower class, middle class woman going out to the market would have her market wallet. So this is basically the kind of precursor to a big purse. You've got a giant kind of rectangle square, and inside it you've got a big slit, and you can reach inside and grab all the things you need out of there. So this is kind of the classic outfit of the mid kind of 1700s. Alright, so our next outfit we have here is a round gown. So we can tell this is a round gown because we've got kind of the straight, kind of pointed top bottom that this has, and we've also got the skirt connected to the jacket as well. So this would have been kind of, the skirt would have been tied up the same way, except this whole jacket piece would have been attached to the back half. So once you do all those up, then you put the jacket on over top of that and do it up with just pins instead of buttons or hooks and eyes and things like that. This would have been attached with just pins together. We've used the same fichu again because it looks good, but usually back in the 18th century, matching fabrics and patterns was not a high priority thing. So usually everything was just kind of mismatched and all kinds of patterns matched with everything. Alright, so that's kind of our middle to lower class kind of looks. Now we're going to move on to the higher middle class. Alright, so our next dress here, we have an open robe gown. So this is open robe because it has a separate piece that is attached to the bodice here, the top part of the jacket. So this is all attached here, and then the underskirt to the petticoat here matches the top bit. They didn't always match, but for this one in particular it does match. Again, same basic shapes, same basic sleeves. We have a different fichu here. Instead of cotton, this one is made out of raw silk, so a bit higher class. And then of course this is all hand-printed cotton from India, what they would have had. The lower classes would have been just kind of plain cotton or plain linen. And then the back is kind of more detailed in how it's constructed. All right. Also we have our headwear that most women would have had. And this one is a simple linen cap. So this would have been kind of on top of the head, covered the ears, covered the hair, and then kind of single women or married women could have decorations like this silk ribbon. Sometimes it was you wore a plain cap until you were married, and then your husband would have bought you decorations to show off that you were married. Alright, so that's our open robe gown. Alright, so our next piece here, this is crawling into the more the 1780s and 90s. You can see that the waistline is raised up a little bit, and the kind of decorations are extending a bit more. This is still the caraco style, so it still has a jacket with the back, but the front is kind of cut a little bit differently. And we've also got these kind of extensive ruffles on the bottom of the petticoat here, just to kind of give it an extra boost of prettiness. Sleeves are still cut the same. You can see the kind of sharp elbow cut on the back here because women kind of always kept their arms kind of resting on their hips like so. So they kind of kept the bend in the arm like that. Alright, so you can see this one's missing the fichu because it's got enough kind of ruffles around the neck to kind of cover the back, and whoever this woman would have been probably would not have been out in the sun for very much. Yeah. Alright, so our next dress here is an open robe, robe à l'anglaise, so the English gown. So this one is kind of open front here. You can see the skirt is visible. We've got the same kind of basic front as the round gown, but on the back is a bit different. You can see we've got kind of a big poof back. It's all kind of hiked up at the back. So this is called a polonaise. So the polonaise is basically kind of based on the fact that the country of Poland back then had a revolution and it was split into 3 parts. So the fashion at the time was to take your dress and split it into 1, 2, 3 parts and become a polonaise, or a Poland kind of style. The back here is also called en furreau, so it's all pleated into different parts, making it look very fancy, and then continues on into the skirt. Alright, so this would have been kind of like higher middle class or high class outfit. Alright, so our last piece for the women's side is the riding habit. So this came about in the early or the mid 1600s, but it didn't become very popular until the mid 1700s. So this one here we've got is kind of like a 1760s style riding habit. We've got the kind of plaid, obviously, is kind of the Scottish symbol. We've got kind of Scottish symbols embroidered on the front of the thing. This was all based on kind of masculine military wear, so you can see there's a lot of masculine influences in it. And of course this was mainly for riding, hunting, things like that. So the one skirt probably would have had like a longer side so that they could sit side saddle on the horse and just still keep their legs covered. But yeah, so sometimes they were meant for just walking in and saying that you were possibly going riding. But yeah, so this is our riding habit, and yeah, now we'll move on to the men's section. Alright, so now we're going to start dressing the male outfits. We've got a kind of mid 1700s to late 1700s outfit, and then we're going to move on to a Regency outfit as well. So obviously everything starts with the undershirt or the shirt. Men and women wore these, so this is kind of the men's version. This one's kind of a later version, so it's got the buttons all the way down. Otherwise they just would have had a kind of a slit down here and then tied with either a single button or with the stock wrapped around the neck as well. Alright, so the next bit we're going to put on is our waistcoat. So the waistcoat here in this case is made out of wool and cotton. You've got a wool front, and then on the back is cotton. And you can also see here it is an adjustable waistcoat. So this slit here that goes all the way up to here, this could be adjustable for as you grow, as you get the obvious weight as you get older, or you could even hand it down to your son as a hand-me-down and cinch it back all the way out to the bottom again. The slit was for riding horses. You would be in the saddle a lot, and this was to keep your kind of clothes clean, was to have the slit at the back there. And then of course the buttons, we would have had buttons either of metal, we have buttons of wood, bone, things like that. A lot of the times it probably would have been made out of fabric, or like wooden buttons covered with fabric to match the fabric of the front of the coat. Alright, so that's our next one, and then we're going to add the coat. Alright, so now we've got our coat on. This would have been called a frock coat. You can see here we've got the fabric covered buttons that go all the way down. Most of the time it would have been left unbuttoned. If they did want to button it, they probably would have buttoned maybe the top 2 or 3 and then left the rest undone. You can see we've got functional pockets in this one, nice cuffs that were kind of the smaller cuffs. Usually later or earlier in the 1700s the cuffs would have gone quite a bit bigger and a lot wider. Again, we've got the slit up the back for riding on the saddle. And the last piece that we would add to this is our stock. So we saw this with the woman's riding coat, riding habit. So we've got a long piece of black silk, and this would have been tied around the neck like so. And there's a couple styles to wear this in. This was the kind of simple version. This one was called just the farmer. This was just kind of basic, and then would have been tucked into the waistcoat. And then the fancier version we would have done like this, and this would have been kind of worn into town and worn to show off to the ladies, you know, showing that you were single or looking or things like that. So this would have been kind of tied in a bow and then made quite big, like so. So that one was called the flirt. All right, so we're going to go back to the farmer because I like that one better. But and then unfortunately we don't have any examples here of the breeches or the trousers that would have been worn during this period. However, we do have a kilt, so we're going to show off how the kilt would have been folded up and wrapped around the waist like the Scots would have done. All right. Alright, so now we've got our great kilt on. Alright, I'm going to take the coat off just because it's a little too bulky for the coat to fit over top. But you can see here we've got the tartan kind of folded over the one side. We've got the kilt pinned to keep it together at the bottom. We've got the sporran at the front. Usually, sometimes they would have had two belts to hold it in, one to kind of sit over it and hold the sporran and everything. We've got one today. Fun fact about the kind of tartans, this is actually not belonging to one particular clan, as it were. The tartan idea of what we have today, with each one dedicated to each clan, was kind of actually a Victorian thing. When Victoria and Albert kind of bought the castle in Balmoral, they kind of helped revive the Scottish thought up there, and they kind of made everyone choose their own tartan. So before that, it was just kind of regional tartan. So if you were from this village, then you'd have the same tartan as everyone else from the village. It didn't matter about your last name. So you can see here at the back, it's all kind of bundled up. So this was one way to tuck it. You just kind of tuck it into the back of your belt. You could also kind of take the whole thing and just hook it over your shoulder, like some people did. So that's kind of like the classic image of Highlanders, is kind of having it over the shoulder, and that's where you get the kind of kilt shape from. You could also do one side over the shoulder and one kind of under the arm, and then hooked together at the front with a big pin. So that was a couple ideas of how they could have done that. Obviously, the Scottish had to have shorter coats just to be able to fit all this extra fabric at the back underneath the tails of their coats, but for the most part, that's what we got. All right, so now we're going to move on to our 1800s, the Regency period outfit, and we're going to put it on our other mannequin. All right, so we've got our early 1800s shirt up here first. As you can see, this one kind of goes halfway down and then leaves the rest plain. We've also got a pair of trousers, so these are full-length trousers. Normally in the 1700s, they would have gone to just above the knee or down just below the knee, and these ones go all the way down to the bottom. Similar to the 1700s, we've also got a fall front. So you can see here, we've got a kind of flap that comes down and buttons up. About the 1820s, they would have introduced the button fly, so similar to what we have today, just with buttons. And then suspenders and belts would have come in later as well. So we're going to put, unfortunately we can't put this on the mannequin, but we are going to move on to the next item, which is our waistcoat. So you can see this waistcoat is a little bit different from the 1800 or the 1700s one. This one, while also made out of silk, it has a kind of flat cut across the bottom. So this is basically the change in style around the 1700, 1800 changeover century. Became kind of more showing off the masculine figure, the masculine frame, making women more soft, more round shapes, and then the men had to be kind of the more conical shapes. So this is kind of showing off the size of the torso, the kind of the barrel chested, and then also showing off the trousers, the fit legs, things like that, making sure men had kind of heavy calves, heavy thighs, that kind of thing. Yeah, and then the closure is a little bit different on the back of this one. You can see we've got kind of a buckle strap instead, so it just kind of closes up and tightens like that. So a little bit different than the slit that we saw earlier. All right, next we're going to put our coat on. All right, so now we have our frock coat on. You can see the same kind of hemline follows from the waistcoat, so it cuts straight across, and then it continues around the back. So you can see this one has the hemline follow the whole back. And then we also have the tailcoats and the slit down the back for riding in the saddle. Our last piece of material to add on, we've got our stock, which was still popular in those days. This one we're going to add as the flirt, just because it looks a bit better with this outfit. And then of course no gentleman was complete without a hat. So in the 1800s or the 1700s, this would have been a some kind of tricorn hat, or a hat with kind of the sides left down or one side up. It wasn't necessarily the three corners hat that we think of today. But eventually around the 1790s, the top hat was invented, and then it became popular throughout the entire 1800 period. So we've got our top hat here. This would go on top, and you can see quite a dapper gentleman that we have here. All right, so that's our last costume to show you, and we'll get back to the presentation. Thank you. Thank you for tuning in to today's presentation. If you have any questions, feel free to direct them to the Brantford Historical Society, or me at Myrtleville House Museum. If you have an interest in historical costuming or simply want to learn more, check out these resources. Patterns of Fashion from Janet Arnold. Costume Close-Up, Linda Baumgarten and John Watson. How to Read a Dress, Lydia Edwards. Historic Costumes and How to Make Them, Mary Fernald and E. Shenton. The American Duchess Guide to 18th Century Dressmaking, Lauren Stowell and Abby Cox. 18th Century Embroidery Techniques, Gil Marsh. 17th and 18th Century Fashion in Detail, Avril Hart and Susan North.